Hello and welcome to the second episode of Dive Into the Backlog, where I try my best to work through the over 300 games I've acquired and never played. As a side effect of my chronic hoarding problem, I disguise under the visor of collecting. In the last one of these, I kinda just did a general grab bag of series I was already familiar with, either through past experiences with other entries, or from watching videos about them on YouTube. So this time around I decided to do full-on blind playthroughs of games from 3 franchises I have next to no history with. And by sheer coincidence, all of them ended up being action-heavy games that released towards the start of the 6th generation of consoles. So let's stop wasting time and just go straight into things. Soulcalibur is one of those series that I've always heard of, whether that be due to some YouTubers I used to watch passively mentioning it, the memes that popped up from 6's custom characters, or because I eventually became a fan of its more popular cousin in Tekken, but I just never really got around to it. And as far as the general perception of the series, the only thing I really know about it is that the fans don't like the 5th game for whatever reason, which apparently culminated in the 6th one being a soft reboot that retconned 5 as an alternate bad future. Now, whilst I haven't played Soulcalibur before, and don't have experience with specifically weapon fighters, I do have a fair share of experience with 3D fighting games. Obviously there's Tekken, but I've also played a fair share of Virtua Fighter, as well as a few other Sega AM2 fighters, thanks to their inclusion as mini-games in the Yakuza series. I've actually had a physical copy of the GameCube version of Soulcalibur II for a while, but I was incentivized to finally play it when I got a Switch 2, due to it being one of the first 3 games featured on the Nintendo Classics GameCube app. So I started things off by playing an arcade mode run, and I played as Link, cause... well, come on, he's objectively the coolest thing about the game. The mode itself is more or less what you'd expect, series of fights against random enemies, ending off with a rival fight and an end boss, which in this game's case is a guy called Inferno, who actually has a pretty cool gimmick, where during the battle he switches between the fighting style of 3 random characters on the roster. Plus he's a flaming skeleton, so it's automatically a peak design. For the combat itself, you're mostly using 3 buttons to attack with a vertical strike, horizontal strike, and a fast moving kick, along with special attacks that can be performed by pressing multiple buttons at the same time. Honestly, the only bit of the general rhythm I had trouble with was blocking. Not because there's a massive delay or there's something wrong with it, but just because it's a separate button and my Tekken brain is too used to holding back to block. Plus, sometimes I just forget to stop moving, so I end up doing the input for a parry instead of actually blocking. However, since those are more skill issues on my part and just not being used to the controls yet, I'm willing to give it a pass, especially when the moment-to-moment gameplay is still really fun and fluid despite my own deficiencies. And if a fighting game being fun to play isn't enough for you, for some reason, not only do the graphics still hold up fairly well in my opinion, matching up with the PS2 Tekkens, but the soundtrack is some great stuff, with even the small touches being nice, like the opening narration for fights which gives some quick lore on the combatants you're about to fight. Plus, there's seemingly plenty of stuff to do with a survival mode, extra modes for equipable weapons and unlockable stages, and I even tried out a bit of the Weapon Master mode, which seems to be like a sort of mission mode with a non-canon story which has you in pursuit of Soul Edge, the sentient weapon that is kind of the main villain of the series, I think? Again, not an expert, and I'm not caught up on the lore. So, yeah, overall, this was an enjoyable time, and if you have a Switch 2, I recommend checking it out. Only real complaint is that outside of some mods that appear to still be in development, there doesn't seem to be a way to play the game with all 3 guest characters. The closest being Soulcalibur II HD, though not only was that missing Link, who, again, is the coolest one out of the 3 in my opinion, but they also got delisted a few years back, so you can't even buy it anymore. Hopefully it being in the launch lineup of the Switch 2's GameCube app is a sign that the series is on the way to being revived, after the 6th one apparently underperformed, or at the very least didn't meet Bandai Namco's expectations. Though given Bandai Namco's recent behaviour, I would not hold my breath for that. Devil May Cry is a franchise that prior to this video I was fairly familiar with in terms of its general history as a franchise, but not with the actual goings-on outside of the most surface level knowledge. Stuff like Dante being a demon hunter who's half demon himself, the games being generally good with the exception of 2 and the reboot, and people seem to really like Virgil for whatever reason. However, whilst I haven't played DMC before, I have beaten the first 2 Bayonetta games, which are in the same genre and had the same creator with the Deki cameo. And as far as PS2 hack and slash games go, I also recently played through the original God of War, so I went in not being too lost on the general goings on. To give some specifics, I played this game with the DMC HD collection on PS4, which also comes with remasters of both DMC 2 and DMC 3 Special Edition. Now, as far as the combat itself goes, just to get the most obvious stuff out of the way, it's fairly basic, and whilst there's some stuff I'm not a fan of, like having to be locked onto an enemy to use the guns, especially during the first-person swimming sections, along with having to get used to the fact that there's no block button, which apparently is a series tradition, I'm willing to give most of it somewhat of a pass given it's the first game and they didn't really have anything else to compare it to since it was effectively pioneering a new genre. The closest comparison I can make being arcade beat-em-ups, and even then that's kind of a stretch. Other than that though, the only other issues I have with combat is that whilst there is a decent enough variety of enemies, most fights still end up boiling down to mashing triangle and then popping double trigger to get through them faster. Plus, with the exception of Nello Angelo, all the bosses are at best okay, with others, most notably Griffin, being pretty boring. Maybe this was just down to me playing the game on normal, but given the game doesn't give you the option to play on a harder difficulty until you've already finished the game on normal, there wasn't really anything I could do about it. The only other major criticism I remember hearing about this game before playing was that some people just couldn't get on with the fixed camera angles, which came about due to the game actually starting life as a potential concept for Resident Evil 4. Personally, I didn't really have any problems with it, as it's usually far back enough that you can still get a clear view of the area, with the only difficulties being the odd platforming sections where I sometimes got screwed over due to lack of depth perception. The only time I'd say the fixed camera actively got in the way of a fight is the first battle against Phantom at the end of Chapter 3, where the angles you're given and the general cramped arena lead to multiple occasions where I got hit by projectiles I just flat out couldn't see coming, unintentionally making what was likely supposed to be a fairly easy fight not necessarily hard, but tricky. Finally, I feel as though this game's presentation has held up remarkably over the years, the gothic art style and music that plays whilst you go through the castle being a particular highlight, and I'm fairly curious to see if this kind of stuff gets carried over to the later games, or if it's just another remnant of it originally being a Resi game, given the clips I've seen and music I've heard from the later games tend to more focus on the over-the-top battles and their respective tracks. Really, there's only one negative I can think of, and even then I believe it's more the fault of the remaster than the original game. That being, some of the pre-rendered cutscenes seem to be noticeably pixelated, likely from where they've been upscaled. Other than that, stellar stuff all around, especially for a game that released in 2001. This was another fun surprise, and unlike a lot of Pioneer titles, I can safely say Devil May Cry 1 is a game that actually still holds up to this day, and that I look forward to playing the rest of the series. Except for maybe DMC 2. To wrap things up for today, we'll be looking at the series I was the least familiar with, Halo. As not only do I have very limited experiences with first-person shooters, only having 20 hours in Team Fortress 2 and playing the first handful of levels in Doom 93 in 2016, but I've never played any Microsoft franchise before, as I was too young to have an original Xbox. The only games I played on 360 were various LEGO titles and Sonic Generations, and the Xbox One's offering things just never interested me, with the same being true for the Xbox Series. Couple that with Microsoft just generally seeming like a kinda shitty company, especially when it comes to how they treat their developers, along with how most people seem to think their output fell off towards the end of the 360's lifespan, and I just never really had the incentive to check their stuff out. But that changes today as I play through the campaign for their first big exclusive, Halo Combat Evolved, or more commonly known as just Halo 1. For specifics, I played the game via the Master Chief Collection on an Xbox One X, the compilation featuring the titles Xbox 360 Remaster Halo Anniversary, which featured completely redone graphics, though for my playthrough I decided to stick with the original visuals, which you can switch between at any time with just a press of a button. Now, the best way to talk about Halo's gameplay is to look at the two main aspects that help differentiate it from other shooters at the time: the two weapon carry limits and the energy shield. To start off, unlike games such as Doom or Half-Life, where you accrue multiple weapons over the course of a playthrough and keep them all until you reach the end, Halo instead only lets you carry two weapons at a time, with you needing to find new ones lying on the ground or from defeated enemies if you want to switch to something else. Whilst this may sound like it's limiting options, this design choice instead leads to a lot of quick decision making on what weapons would be the best loadout for an upcoming scenario, each one having varying strengths and weaknesses, such as the pistol and rifle letting you zoom in for easier shots, or the shotgun's high damage on close range, along with maybe creating some niche scenarios such as having to consider whether it's worth ditching a weapon you don't have much ammo for a brand new one you have no familiarity with. Meanwhile, the energy shield, which automatically regenerates after enough time passes, helps eliminate the issue of needing to constantly hunt for health packs, whilst also ensuring you will still be punished and potentially die if you get too reckless. Couple that with the fact that Halo, whilst not inventing it, is the game often credited for popularizing the twin-stick control scheme used by basically every first-person shooter nowadays. And I can definitely see why this game was viewed as a very innovative title for the genre. Now, the gameplay is only one factor as to what makes Halo so good, the other big one being its presentation, which despite being a launch title for the original Xbox, still looks really good over 20 years later, with incredible art direction that's able to make areas like the Human and Covenant ships, along with Halo itself, all feel visually distinct from each other, whilst all still believably being from the same universe, coupled with an immaculate soundtrack that perfectly fits the tone of every scene it's used in, whilst also being a pleasant listen on its own, in combination with writing which not only creates a lot of intrigue of both the purpose of the titular Halo and the secrets hidden within it, but also has character writing that's capable of being able to crack jokes every now and again, without coming off as distracting when the plot does get more serious, helping make the cast feel like actual people instead of just gruff robots or snarky quip machines. All of these combine to create a title that I not only fully understand why it ended up almost single-handedly carrying the Xbox brand to relevance at the start, along with Master Chief himself becoming the system's mascot, but it's also currently the only game competing with Mario Kart World for the best game I've played this year. The only negative I have is that I feel some of that art direction got lost in the remaster's new visuals in favor of just making the graphics look as good as possible. But since you can literally just switch back to the original visuals at any point, it's really not that big of an issue. And my only disappointment is that I just didn't get to try out Halo's legendary multiplayer, due to not having a second controller on hand or an Xbox Live subscription, and frankly, I don't make enough money off of YouTube to justify buying either for just one video. This is definitely another series I want to play more of, or at the very least, the rest of the titles made by Bungie, as I've heard mixed things about Halo's output when 343 Industries took over development duties. In fact, you can actually argue the same thing happened to Bungie after they left Halo to make the Destiny games, which I've heard mixed opinions on ever since the first game launched in 2014. Coincidence? Probably yes. So yeah, really positive experiences all around this time, and if you have any way of playing the games I've talked about today, I definitely encourage you to do so. If you have any suggestions for this series, either based on what I've discussed today, previously, or any of the games listed on my backlogged page, please shout it out in the comments. Otherwise, I hope to see you again next time, and thanks for watching.